Well, ladies and gentlemen, in a way we come to the last part of our conference, and that will be about mergers. What you hear about from now on is about mergers, how we deal with mergers. I think we all are of the opinion that merger control has become more important everywhere, but especially in the digital arena. And it is also not a secret that mergers are not an easy thing to do in the digital arena. So we get an introductory keynote on this question today by Lina, chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission in Washington. Lina, you have the stage and the floor.
Good morning, everybody. It's such a delight to be here with you all. Thanks so much to Andreas for his leadership and for everyone involved in planning this year's meeting. It's been so wonderful to get to meet so many of you in person for the first time and to really witness firsthand the richness of the ICN discussions. So as many of you know, competition law in the United States is currently in the midst of a broad and sweeping reassessment. The significance of this reassessment is perhaps best embodied by President Biden's issuance last summer of an executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. In the executive order, the president explained that the last 40 years of antitrust enforcement and competition policy in the United States had failed to keep markets competitive, with consolidation and concentration now rampant across our economy, resulting in higher prices, lower wages, declining rates of entrepreneurship, growing inequality, and a less vibrant democracy. In his remarks announcing the executive order, the president said that this state of affairs was the result of a choice 40 years ago to follow, quote, the misguided philosophy of people like Robert Bork, end quote. In other words, not only did the president note that declining competition was now a systemic rather than an isolated feature of the US economy, but he expressly attributed this problem to a set of theories and an analytical framework. So this is the backdrop against which competition enforcement in the United States is occurring today. A backdrop where the president says, we have a problem, and that problem is the result of having chosen the wrong policies and the wrong framework 40 years ago. Perhaps more mundanely, though no less significant, the executive order also charged a whole set of federal agencies with deploying their tools and legal authorities with an eye to promoting competitive markets. There were 72 specific suggestions and directives in the executive order, giving federal agencies across the government an action plan on which to execute. In other words, this is going to be a whole of government approach to fixing this problem, not one that's just limited to the Federal Trade Commission and the Antitrust Division. So this is the backdrop against which we are operating today. The president's executive order is by no means the driver of reform, but I think it really underscores a deep mandate for change and a commitment to creating the enabling environment for reform. If we are successful and the US regime does take a major course correction, I think it will also invite us to consider how the ICN can or should be reacting to the shifting consensus within the United States. One immediate area where we could see this change is our approach to merger investigations and review. Merger investigations invite us to make a set of predictive assessments, and for decades, we in the US have relied on a predictive model that generally assumed that markets would self-correct and that erroneous enforcement would be more costly than erroneous non-enforcement. We're now at a moment where both the experience of the US antitrust agencies and a growing set of empirical research is showing that these assumptions appear to have been at odds with some of the market realities. Merger enforcement is both our first-line defense against unlawful consolidation and the most cost-effective enforcement tool to guard against the market structures that can give rise to monopolization and tacit coordination, conduct that can become much more difficult to detect and prosecute after the fact. Since I arrived at the FTC last summer, a significant portion of my efforts and energy have been devoted to examining how we can better harness our tools to check unlawful mergers, which was in particular catalyzed by the huge surge in deal volume that we saw last year. This past January, the FTC and the DOJ jointly kicked off a review of our merger guidelines. We realized that we need to approach merger review with a greater sense of humility when it comes to the efficacy of our predictive models and frameworks. We need to be acknowledging that our approach has missed too many transactions that ultimately did substantially lessen competition and spur undue consolidation, contributing to markets that are now suffering from a lack of dynamism. We are not, of course, alone in revising the guidelines. Many of you in this room have recently revised your guidelines or are currently process of doing so, and we are learning from your experience. In March, Jonathan and I were lucky to be able to welcome many of you to an enforcement summit that we held, where we heard from both domestic and international partners about your experiences and some of the challenges that you face in merger review. These discussions have already been enormously informative for us, and we look forward to continuing to solicit your input and feedback as we move ahead. While we are still in the process of developing our guidelines, I wanted to share briefly just a few key considerations and aims that are guiding our review. So one primary goal is ensuring that our frameworks are accurately reflecting contemporary commercial realities. There is concern that our prior guidelines may have frozen in place certain economic and descriptive theories about markets that now might be outdated. And so we must revise our models and our theories to fit some of the new facts and evidence. Matching our analysis to contemporary business strategy requires that our tools be dynamic and holistic rather than static and atomistic. Accordingly, we've really prioritized seeking comment and input from a broad set of market participants and experts, including those that have actually lived through and experienced firsthand some of the effects of unlawful mergers and acquisitions. A second key goal is ensuring that the guidelines are faithful to our statutory mandate. The US Congress was unequivocal that merger enforcement is intended to stop, in their incipiency, trends towards concentration. We are revisiting the guidelines to ensure that they are aligned with controlling legal precedent, as well as with the text, structure, and history of our statutory text. It's no secret that Congress named the 1950 amendments to the Clayton Act the Anti-Merger Act, and so we must fully hew to the law, including by applying both the incipiency standard and by examining when a deal may tend to create a monopoly. The guidelines are also designed to provide clarity, and we seek for our revision to improve both administrability and predictability. We are considering greater reliance on strong presumptions in order to avoid using some of our scarce resources to prove that mergers involving high market shares are illegal. We are reviewing the 2010 HHI levels and examining empirical work, including work showing that structural measures of competition can be highly probative. Even in the absence of triggering a presumption, we are currently identifying additional factors that are predictive of future harm, including direct evidence of competitive effects and industry trends and patterns of consolidation. Three substantive areas that are particularly in focus for us are digital markets, labor markets, and non-horizontal mergers. So it's clear that the guidelines must better account for certain features of digital markets, including zero price markets, the competitive significance of data, and the network externalities that we've seen time and time again can lead markets to quickly tip. It's also clear that the guidelines must better explain how we will be analyzing whether a merger unlawfully reduces competition in labor markets. Over the last few years, there's been a host of empirical research that has shown that labor markets across the US tend to be highly concentrated, with the US Treasury Department recently estimating that a lack of competition may be costing workers up to 25% of their wages. And so it's important for us to be incorporating insights from some of this new learning. Lastly, we are looking to improve our learning on non-horizontal mergers. including deals that might be described as ecosystem-driven, concentric, or conglomerate. While the US antitrust agencies closely grappled with some of these dynamics during the 60s and 70s, where we saw industrial-era conglomerates, we need to update that thinking for the current economy. We must examine how a range of strategies and effects, including extension strategies and portfolio effects, can warrant enforcement action as well. We are currently in the process of reviewing the thousands of comments that we have received and the information that we are gathering through these listening forums that we are doing. We are currently aiming to issue the draft guidelines in the coming months and a final document by the end of the year. And it'll be really terrific to solicit your feedback and reactions in response to the draft document that, again, we're hoping to be able to put out sometime this summer. So as you've heard, the US agencies are currently on the front lines of a broad reassessment of the effectiveness of our competition tools and our approach to law enforcement. Reforms, potentially significant ones, are ahead. The US, of course, is far from alone in seeing the need for a course correction, and in certain regards, I imagine some of its reforms may bring it in closer alignment with our other jurisdictions. Given that we are here at ICN, it's also worth considering how we, as a network, can or should be reacting to what could end up being a shifting consensus. A key goal of the ICN has been to promote best practices. While these are a non-binding form of soft law, these recommended practices have, in certain instances, been widely adopted by ICN members. The recommended practices for merger notification and review procedures seem to be a particular area where we now see broad acceptance. So today we have a whole body of prescriptive work on merger analysis and notification procedures, on unilateral conduct and advocacy, work that is regularly referred to as the gold standard. I think a key question for us is going to be how we ensure that some of these best practices keep pace with the new learning and the changes in consensus that we in the US in particular are currently grappling with. One of the key benefits of the ICN has been that continued experimentation and the testing of new techniques has allowed us to consistently and constantly be identifying superior practices on an ongoing basis. The relative agility of ICN makes it a prime venue for ensuring that the international community's best practices are evolving with the times and keeping pace with both new market realities and new economic learning. We are fortunate to have this incredible community of international experts and enforcers, and seeing the like-mindedness that we already share makes me incredibly excited about what more we can be achieving collectively, especially in this remarkable moment of deep fluidity and flux in the United States. So thank you so much, and really look forward to the ongoing discussion and debate that we'll be continuing to have in the coming months.
So the first question to the panel, to some of the panelists, is I think a concern I have and most of us have, which is for merger control, particularly for big mergers, international mergers, the direction of travel over the last 20 years has always been longer investigations, more data, more internal documents, more discussions with market participants, longer decisions, and in many ways, more complicated litigation when it happens. So at some point, this has to stop. I mean, we can't, and at the same time, it's easier for us now to access more data, more documents, do more analysis. So, but we are in charge of the process, so we need to think about what is the right balance. So let me start with you, Reiko, on, I mean, A, do you agree that this is a problem? And B, what are you doing in Japan to try to deal with this challenge?
Okay, thank you, Andrea. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel. And let me just explain about the little fellow here. He's it is the JFTC mascot who came from space to help us with competition policy. Now, to answer your question, Andrea, well, in case of JFTC, we actually have not observed a greater length of investigation, although there's been some very prominent cases that has taken a long time. And I think, this is my personal opinion, what is happening is the following. There's kind of a polarization of length of time required for merger review, both because of advancement in ITC. So there's more data, but we also are accumulating technology to use the data more quickly. So some cases are becoming shorter, while at the same time, as you pointed out, because there's so much data and because the technology is complicated, the review takes longer. So in Japan, at the JFTC, lengthening of the review process is not that big a concern. Instead, I'd just like to comment, because this is the ICN, about collaboration and merger review and how that can be used to shorten the merger review time required. And yesterday there was a panel where people have already talked about the benefits of sharing information and communicating. And I think maybe we should start the communication or widen the communication, start earlier or widen the coverage of communication to include the design of remedies so that communication among agencies can start at the very beginning of designing remedies. Because the firms are global and markets are global, one remedy in one country could have unexpected effects in other countries, and that could even undo or lessen the effectiveness of remedy in another country, where you have to go back to the beginning and redesign the remedy. And to avoid that kind of wasting resources and extra time for reviewing, it might be a good idea to start the communication process, sharing information at an earlier time in the remedy design process. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Reiko. Cani, I mean, obviously you've done lots of mergers from the other side, and then you spent the last few months in this new role. I mean, what's your assessment? I mean, having been on both sides, I mean, are we spending too much time on some mergers where maybe the answer is not that complicated? I mean, what is your strategy in terms of both the domestic and obviously you also have the interesting interplay with the Commission on referrals and advice and all of that?
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure being here, and it's almost going to be 2 years in June, not somehow. So
sorry, I guess it's a COVID effect. Of,
absolutely, absolutely right. But that is absolutely, and in fact, it is true as well that I was this morning listening to our colleague from Sweden, and I have to say that the same tendency in the increase of in the number of mergers have been also the case in Spain. In 2021, the number of mergers that we analyzed and were notified is the highest since 2016, which was another record year. And it is true that, well, we have over more than 100 mergers cleared in last year. We don't know whether we thought that it could be the effect of the 2020, because we did have really an impact. We only have 17 that year. So if you combine it, the average is the same. But we are seeing a tendency, an increased tendency as well as to April this year. So yeah, the tendency is increased mergers. It's not only that they increase in number, they also increase in complexity. And we see that because the number of mergers that have been, for example, clear in second phase last year was 4, which is very rare. We had cases of 1 a year in 2020 and 2019, no one in 2016, 17 or 18. So we have 4 this year, and the complexity is rising. These figures also include an important number of mergers that are have been notified due to our market share threshold. As you know, we have on top of the turnover threshold a market share that obliges companies to notify any merger where they're going to increase or acquire, even acquire without overlapping, 30% of market share or more. This threshold has allowed us to review mergers with significant impact in competition, and I will provide some figures to show this, despite a very low level of turnover, even in cases where the target was a starting business, killer acquisitions, and other mergers in the digital area. For example, to give you some figures, 50% of the mergers that were notified to the authority in 2021 did only meet the market share threshold and not the turnover threshold. Only 32% of them met the turnover and 11% reached both. But what is rather clear is that when we go into mergers that have been clear with either conditions or commitments, we have both possibilities in Spain, the number of mergers that had been notified following the market share threshold increases. In general, in average, is almost a third always. But for example, if we go to 2021, 70% of the mergers approved with remedies were notified under the market share threshold, which shows that in this respect, well, it is sending a message. Going into digital or killer acquisitions, and I'm afraid, Jack, that I mentioned the digital word again, I'm sorry, but going into digital, for example, in 2019, these market share thresholds allowed us to review the merger of 6 platforms that did not meet the turnover criterion. This was the case, for example, with the transaction food delivery holdings Just Eat, and Globo, and other 3 more transactions, Bauer Aciertos, Sprina GTI, Idealista International. So there were platforms that did not meet the turnover criterion, but did meet the market share threshold. Regarding also cooperation with other agencies, again, the market share threshold allowed us to review several mergers where we enjoy the cooperation of our peers. For example, with the CMA, the Australian Competition Authority, the New Zealand Competition Authority, and the DOJ. Examples of this: in 2021, we assessed the impact of Turnitin's acquisition of a rival plagiarism detection software provider, Original. And more recently, in 2022, we have cooperated for the assessment of the Norton's acquisition of Avast, active in the cybersecurity software market. These mergers were all of them cleared in first phase, I have to say, without remedies, but it is true that the cooperation was very swift and very useful. Now, in this context, let me just say a word on Article 22 of the merger regulation. You know that we have in Europe, under the merger regulation, the possibility for an authority that has not the possibility of reviewing a merger in their jurisdiction to send it to the European Commission. Now, for Spain, so far, this is not a possibility because our law strictly empowers ourselves to review those mergers in which we have jurisdiction, and those are the ones that we can refer. And we cannot jump in when others are referring. We are following very closely the Illumina Grail case before the General Court, because should the court say that Article 22 is conferring a legal basis for authorities to send the case, then our law would be contrary to European Union law, and we would be free to send it. But so far, that is the situation. However, because of this market share threshold, we've been able to refer cases of importance to the European Commission, and to quote some examples, Facebook, WhatsApp is one of those cases, or Apple Shazam. So I think that we are, in this respect, maybe well-equipped to screen this kind of mergers.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Cani. So let me move to the core of the discussion, which is really about remedies in mergers. I mean, we, as people know, we've always done a lot of work on sort of ex-post merger review, remedies reviews. We have a big report which looks over 20 years to all the behavioral and structural remedies, and has found that in quite a few cases we, I think, quite naively accepted remedies that just didn't work. And some of the behavioral remedies we accepted in the early 2000s, they're still on our book, which again feels very inappropriate in many ways. So we have certainly consciously raised the bar at the CMA. We wrote a joint piece of work with Andreas and Rod Sims a few months ago to try to stress our preference for structural remedies, particularly for simple structural remedies. And obviously, Jonathan Cantor and Lina Khan have said similar things in recent months. So I would like to understand from sort of all of you, I mean, this issue of, what's your current position in terms of, what's your approach to behavioral remedies or structural remedies, when really prohibition kicks in as a proper alternative to extended negotiations or complex remedies in your case, how that interplay, how is the interplay with possible litigation, which obviously tends to be about remedies that you rejected. So Tina, I mean, I think you share a pretty similar outlook with us, and obviously you have blocked some mergers in recent years. I mean, what's your view on this point?
Thank you. At the Norwegian Competition Authority, I can say that we are generally quite hesitant to approve mergers based on behavioral remedies alone. And of course, they will not change incentives or opportunities to exploit market power sufficiently. And I can say that we are hesitant with some confidence because we did, as you mentioned, reviews. And we did a review last year. We have, in the period 2004 to 2020, we had 86 merger cases, and we approved 30 of them with remedies upon the proposed remedies. So when it comes to behavioral remedies, just a few words on that first. We may require behavioral remedies for a shorter period, or for in combination with structural remedies, for example, because competitors, in order to secure competitors' access to input factors. But normally, that is relevant. Behavioral remedies are relevant primarily in vertical mergers. When it comes to structural remedies, there are many. So we prefer structural remedies and fix-it-first remedies. We want them in place before we approve the merger. But in practice, there are many reasons why companies might be unable to propose remedies that are sufficiently efficient for us to accept the merger in question. So one difficulty is that it can be hard to find a suitable and independent buyer. So the buyer must be sufficiently relevant, and it must be able to verify ability to buy, and it must have no close connections to the seller and not become dependent on the seller as part of the merger case, for example, because of the financial arrangement made to facilitate the merger. And also, the sale, of course, must be sufficiently substantial to secure the required level of competition. And sometimes this is doable only by selling out the crown jewels. And such sales can be very hard to conduct, and sometimes there is a time limit, so it can be hard to do it in time, 6 months deadline, for example. But if it is not doable within the time limit, then we would ask to have a monitor, somebody to oversee the process going forward, to make sure that the conditions that they follow up as required. So generally, to sum up, the difficulties can be, in short, find a suitable and independent buyer, arrange for divestiture. The divestiture can be too complicated, and it can be hard to find a remedy that is substantial enough. So we aim for the structural remedies, but in practice, it's hard.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Tina. Reiko, do you want to go next on your views in Japan about remedies? You have accepted fairly long behavioral remedies recently, yes. For instance, in Google Fitbit.
Yes. Thank you, Andrea. At the JFTC also, we prefer structural remedies to behavioral remedies, but as you just mentioned, very recently, when we did the Google Fitbit merger review. There were only behavioral remedies available. There were 3 parts to the remedy. One was information following the health data that Fitbit collected would be separated from Google's advertising arm, and then access to the information and also non-discriminatory access to the Android API. Those are the 3 behavioral remedies that we approved with a trustee oversight, and it would be at least 10 years long, and we have the option to extend it to 20 years. And the trustee is to give JFTC a report every 6 months. And so far, we have been happy with how it is going, although, of course, with trustees, you have to be careful who you choose, and we also need to have an oversight over the trustee in order for the behavioral remedy to be successful.
Sorry, Reiko, can I ask you a question? So let's say 3 years from now, the trustee tells you that the remedy is not working because technology has moved on, things have changed. What's the mechanism? Are you able to vary the remedy, or in a sense, this is it, and that the remedy stays as it is?
We will be varying the remedy.
Okay, you can vary the remedy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. Well, yeah, 3 years, but your concern is well-founded, and it actually might become irrelevant completely in 3 years also, but we designed it so that it would be relevant, and we have contingent plans also. Thank you. We also try to be, because we have a preference for behavioral remedies, we try to be innovative with, preference for structural remedies. We also try to be a little innovative with structural remedies, because you often have the problem that you mentioned about limits to divestiture. And one good such example is the review that we had, merger review, of 2 mergers that were happening at the same time in the same market. So it was merger of Idemitsu and Showa Shell, 2 companies, and another merger of JXAG, HD, and Tone in general. They're the 2 companies. And they're both, all 4 of them sell petroleum derivative products like gasoline and butane gas, propane gas, for instance. And they either import the product itself or they import the petroleum and process them themselves, and they would sell it to the wholesaler. And what made the merger evaluation complicated was the 4 firms had shares in some of the wholesalers that they sold their products to. So there was going to be concentration in the product market, but also concentration in the ownership of the wholesale firms. So it was a very complicated merger review, and there were actually 45 products derived from petroleum. But most of them did not have competitive concerns for us. So we reviewed 6 of them. And what we did was we employed a structural model that took into account the product market and also the ownership by the upstream firms, so the wholesalers. And we used simulation to find out the effect of the merger and also how effective the remedies would be. And the remedies were all structural, and most of them were divestitures, but one of them was making sure that there was going to be import pressure in the market because there was no appropriate divestiture method. And the way we secured pressure from imports was to reduce the cost of rivals to import a substitute product. And the way we did it is because of this legal requirement that when you import these petroleum products, there's legal obligation for the firms to also make a stockpile of the products. You often have 180 days of stockpile of the products or inventory, and there are legal requirements that's proportional to the quantity that you import and according to the product. So the merging firm committed to providing the stockpile that the firms would need in order to import the product. So the import pressure to provide discipline in the product market was a lot more credible because import was actually going to be a lot cheaper than it would be otherwise, which could have been the reason they didn't import until now in the first place. And so far, it seems to be working. Right. And I thought that was an example of trying to be a little creative with structural remedy.
Thanks, Reiko. Alexandre, what's the situation in Brazil on remedies?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. So Brazil is also, as Cani said, is also increasing a lot of the number of the merger and acquisitions. Increase in 2019, 2020, 2021 was a record, was around 600 cases. 9% of that is fast track, 10% is kind of complex case. Not complex, but ordinary, and 5% is a complex case that we usually we block or need some structural remedy or behavioral remedy. CADE has a remedy guideline that show for the society what kind of type of remedy we want or we like. Usually, the best practice is we like structural remedy, but not always we can, apply a structural remedy. And we have to live with the behavioral remedy as well. So, and we know that it's very hard to monitoring, high costs, and sometimes you don't know the effectiveness of the behavioral remedy. But we have to live with that because when we were constructing the case since the beginning, and Reiko said one thing very important. It's very clear for us that when we start to build a remedy at the beginning and talk to the parties and also talk to the other agencies, we're going to save some time after that. We had a case very important in Brazil that was a big case here in Europe as well, was the Siemens in Alstom. And the case was easy case in Brazil, not easy case, but we had just a problem in one specific market. And the cooperation with EC here was very good. And we just, wasn't a big problem for us. And we were applying a remedy over there that could have a problem here in Europe. But we realized that the big problem was here. What we did was, okay, let's do a time alignment with this merger and wait. So when the decision happened here in Europe, the case was done in Brazil anyway. Mm-hmm. So this kind of things of international cooperation is pretty good to align everything, and a remedy in Europe has direct impact in Brazil, and Brazil also maybe in the United States, because all the multinational companies. And what I'm saying that the size of the cases and everything, we know that when you're applying a remedy, especially when it is a behavioral remedy, we have to monitor this behavioral remedy later. And sometimes we don't know if it is effective or not. And what we're going to do for this case, if it's not effective, but there is two situations. One situation is the company is not follow the rules or the remedy. The other is it is doing everything, but the remedy is wrong. Yeah. The remedy is wrong. So, but the agents choose the remedy. It was agreement. So can I just...
So can I ask you something? What about the level of acceptable risk? So in a sense, you are there to defend consumers. Company comes to you with a complex remedy. You have to judge the likelihood this will work. I mean, is it right for an agency to essentially accept complex remedies and accept that in a certain proportion of cases they will just not work? Because in a sense, they're not working. Essentially, you're transferring money from consumers to the shareholders of these companies. So I don't know, shouldn't there be a process where all of us are reviewing what actually happens and then learn from that and change our approach?
Yes, in Brazil it's possible. But it's not an easy thing to do. Look, I mean, it is a case that we agree with that remedy. It depends actually of the case as well. If they bring a lot of information inside of the case, and this information, when you see like from 2 years, 1 year, whatever it is, that the information wasn't like that, it's much more easy to get, oh, come on, I have wrong information here, was a symmetry of information. We didn't give them everything. So let's change the approach. But if everything was right and the market changed because of the pandemic, because, I don't know, any external variable, it's much more hard for the agency to say, okay, let's change everything that we did and let's start again this merger. Can we do that? Yes, because we're defending consumers. But we really want to do this because of the security of the market. I mean, the idea that we're passing that anytime you can review a past merger, maybe not. So it's not an easy decision, but in our law, it is possible.
And then just final question. I mean, do you prohibit, I mean, is there a stage where you say, look, the remedy is just too complicated or it's too much of the overall transaction, why are we doing it? And essentially you say, we're just going to block it.
Yes. Yes.
You do that.
Yes, it's very normal to do that. Actually, it happens when sometimes, even if the company brings the remedy, you think that the remedy this is just like very creative. I don't think that's going to work, or this is impossible to implement. We just say, okay, safe harbor here is block the deal. Yeah. It's not approved.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. Cani, what's your reflections on the Spanish situation?
Okay, well, we've had to deal with structural remedies in a case in 2009 that did not go very well, so we learned the lesson. And this was a case in which Gas Natural was merging with Unión Fenosa, so two energy companies. And the remedy that was included there was the divestiture of some thermal plants, thermal power plants, in a short period. And then in several months, the situation of the energy market changed dramatically, and it was just impossible for the parties to divest that. So after analysis, and because the parties approached the authorities saying, well, there is no way we can dispose of these assets, there is nobody there that wants to buy them, we had to adapt the obligation, and instead of having a divestiture in some months, we had to monitor an option. I mean, it was an option of purchasing long term for 10 years. So we learned the lesson, and in front of that, in the face of that, we are always favoring when structural remedies are going to be adopted, to have upfront buyers. And that has been normally the case, and there is even a case in which the acquisition of the divested assets was cleared at the same time as the merger. It is the Repsol Petrocat case in which everything was done together. However, it's not that easy. I mean, we don't have to overestimate the possibility of having upfront buyers. That's not always the case. So we have to be very careful in how to manage them. We have also used behavioral remedies, and we have used them when the divestiture was not an option, or when it was very complicated, or there were some regulatory issues that were not allowing us to do that. And we've used that, for example, we have a very good example in the case that I was mentioning before, the merger of these two food delivery platforms. So Just Eat buying La Nevera Roja, so the red fridge, in which we accepted as a commitment to approve it in first phase, the obligation of Just Eat to free all the restaurants that had exclusivity provisions with them. And this allowed 3 other platforms to enter the market that were not there at the beginning, like Deliveroo, Uber Eats, and Globo. So this was a commitment that the parties had for 2 years. It was just the right moment for others to enter, and then afterwards, once you have competition, then the commitment has done its benefit. We have also combined behavioral with structural remedies when we've seen that, for example, divesting an asset would also need some time to really be in the real hands of the buyer. And this was the case in Cemex, which was in the cement industry, where we divested a silo for an upfront buyer, but then we also imposed an obligation on the seller to provide the supply of the cement from that silo to the clients of the buyer so that he could really appropriate the goodwill of the case. As to the duration of the remedies, in the case of behavioral remedies, we normally do an imposition of 3 plus X years, depending on how the situation evolves. And we've been able to impose, for example, this prorogation of an additional period in the Telefónica DTS merger that affected a number of telecoms and audiovisual industries, and where the behavioral commitments have been enlarged for an additional period. Now, it is a question of monitoring. In order to monitor all the remedies, and in particular the behavioral ones, the CNMC created already 10 years ago a monitoring unit who is responsible for the monitoring of not only the payment of the fines or the solutions that we're imposing, but also to monitor closely the remedies that are imposed in competition. And it is crucial, in fact, because we are following absolutely everything in order to make sure that it works. So we have learned some lessons. If you have to divest upfront buyers, you monitor the remedies closely. And if you have to change the remedies that the parties have imposed, in Spain it's difficult. Because if it is a commitment, it's an agreement with the parties, so the parties will have to ask you to modify the remedy. And if it is conditions, I don't know, we haven't done it yet, but we will consider.
Great. So going back to sort of ex post evaluations and talking about remedies, but obviously you can also do ex post evaluations of actual decisions on transactions, whether there was the right decisions or not. And obviously we are in the context of ICN, where there's a lot about learning and learning from each other, learning from history. I mean, we do quite a lot of ex post merger reviews. We've published a couple of weeks ago something on vertical mergers. We did a big one on digital mergers a few years ago, another one on entry and expansion, barriers to entry and expansion. So for us, it's quite important because we think, if you want to be out there and discuss whether there's been merger under enforcement, you obviously, partially, you maybe want to look across the economy at concentration markups, as we do and others do, but also you want to look at individual cases. I mean, just again, going around, I mean, what's your current view in terms of your own agency and more generally also about the general debate? I mean, should we do more also as ICN? So both on assessing remedies, but also on assessing actual decisions. Did we clear some mergers that shouldn't have been cleared, or potentially made mistakes in the other direction? Tina, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, we did a review of the cases, and upon that review, I think the Norwegian Competition Authority is coming out as fairly strict in terms of merger review. We have many small markets, so I think it makes sense as well. And we are not stricter than we are very much aligned with the EU guidelines. So over those 16 years that we reviewed cases, we blocked one more merger or so a year, so it's not strict. We, in more than half of the cases that we approved transactions upon structural remedies. So we use that tool. We are strict on the conditions, and we prohibit if the parties cannot offer proper remedies. But in terms of evaluating cases, I can mention a very recent case in the financial sector, a case that where the biggest bank in Norway wanted to buy the most popular bank in Norway. The smaller bank is popular very much because of its innovative solutions and combined with lower prices. So it was a very important challenger in the market. And And we ruled against the transaction with the explanation that it would harm competition in the market for mutual funds. And the bigger bank proposed remedies. They were fix-it-first remedies, so that's good. But the proposed remedies did not solve the issue, so they offered to transfer fund accounts and transfer technology, but they were not relevant enough. They wouldn't help and transfer technology to players that would not necessarily need the technology. So we couldn't accept them. So, but our decision was appealed to the Competition Complaints Board, which is the level right above us, and they concluded against us. And this is a very new decision. So I just studied it carefully very recently. And there were no doubt that the banks were competitors. So we considered the analytic approach was the same. But the matter of disagreement was related to the question of harm, and specifically whether other competitors would be able to replace the Popular Bank. So it had served as an important challenger in the market for years, but the question was, would it continue to do so? And so in terms of lessons learned, I think we can do more to investigate and describe the counterfactual and how that and consider that vis-a-vis our understanding of the threshold for interference. So I think that was the core.
Sorry, can I just
issue.
you? I mean, was the challenge a judicial review challenge, or was a merits challenge where they actually? So
the complaints board didn't really assess the remedies, so they never got to that. So for the sake of learning from the case, the remedies were not part of the complaints board assessment, unfortunately.
Yeah. But again, it's an indication that the bar for prohibiting mergers is quite high in that case. I mean, in a sense, the court didn't give you much discretion or deference. I mean, they just disagreed with you on the substance in a way.
They agreed, but they wouldn't. It was about the evidence in a sense. But the case also raises the question whether we should be able to appeal, because we cannot appeal the tribunals, complaint board's decisions.
Okay.
So that was another side of it, but not related to remedies.
Thank you. Reiko, what's your view in Japan on ex post assessments and learning from cases?
Well, fortunately, probably compared to the CMA, for instance, we don't do as many retrospectives, although we have been doing retrospectives one every 2 to 4 years. And because we didn't quite have the economic expertise that we have now, these retrospectives were usually done at the Competition Policy Research Center, which is part of JFTC, but the research is done by academics outside the JFTC. So use of data somewhat could be limited. Now that we have updated the economic analysis team to an economic analysis office, and we have hired more economic economists and also data scientists, we hope that we'll be able to do more retrospectives, including evaluating remedies, because we do think it is important. We do read the reviews done by CMA and other authorities, and we read them and learn from them, and we find them very helpful, particularly when they would be a similar merger case and when the remedies might have differed slightly from ours. It helps us understand the remedy and also try to see how the difference in effectiveness. So hopefully 5 years from now, I'll have more to talk about. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Reiko. Alexandre?
Yes, We don't do as much as CMA as well, but I think that we do like once per year. And there is one case, very interesting, civil aviation in Brazil, when a company called Go bought another one, Webjet, and the analysis was interesting because it was a very interesting reduction of the number of the players in that time, and the post-merger analysis confirmed the decision before, because we got a reduction of the price of the fare of the ticket in 8%, and increased the number of the offer of the seats in 28% in this case. In another case as well, of another company called Azul bought another company called Strip. The number was also, we couldn't find any relation about correlation about the increase or the reduction of the fare, the ticket, but we found increased number of increased offer in 27% in the seats. So in that case, it was this gave us more. We want to do it more, because sometimes what is going on the next 3 days, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So in this can prove that maybe the reduction of the number of the players not necessarily would be bad. In that time was a huge discussion about that in those cases, and we almost blocked the case, but there was no relation with. So it's confirmed there was no competition problem with this merger. So.
Great, thanks, Alexandre. Cani?
Well, let me say just to start that as co-chairs of the ICN merger working group, the CNMC organized in February this year precisely over this topic a webinar, and has recently sent a questionnaire to the ICN merger working group members in order to increase the ex-post merger evaluation. I would like to remind you, because if you want to cooperate in this, is something that we will appreciate very much. As for the CNMC, we are trying to carry out some ex-post. It's something that we haven't done in mergers so far. We've done it in other areas, in cartel enforcement, for example. And we were very aware of that when we started, for example, this last year, the analysis of all the mergers that came in the financial sector. We cleared 2 mergers with commitments in both cases. And in the moment of the clearance, we were already taking the necessary steps to be able to do the ex-post merger analysis afterwards. Yeah,
no, that's great. So my final question, again, linked a bit to mergers and possible under-enforcement. So we started last year, and we just published last week, this what we call a state of competition report for the UK market, where, and obviously we also have this markets regime that most of you don't have, where there is an expectation that if there are problems in particular sectors, we can intervene and potentially break up companies. And it's a difficult piece of work because the economics is complicated. The markets don't quite match antitrust markets, so we're talking about bigger aggregates. But we found it quite useful to try to have, once a year, a bit of a snapshot of the state of competition in the overall economy. And we found that concentration has increased, markups have increased, so very similar results to what a number of academic economists have found in the US and other countries. And we are trying to link it a bit to mergers and to try to understand where potentially the under-enforcement has been and where we want to correct. So it's kind of linked a bit to the discussion we just had on ex-post. Is that something that you have been considering or thinking about for your country? Is there some political pressure now that we're all dealing with cost of living and inflation and all these things, for the competition authority to have a bit more of a role in the country as a policymaker to say something about the state of competition, so market structure, do we have enough players in some of these critical markets or not? I don't know who wants to come in, and Tina, you're an academic, so you must have thought about these issues.
Well, yes, and I mentioned to some of you yesterday that I got this deadline from the ministry that I have to come up with solutions for the high prices in the grocery sector by the 20th of May. And that is, of course, an invitation that we take seriously. So we consider how we can use that opportunity to come up with all sorts of arrangements that can reduce competition in markets. We are already strict on mergers in the sector, but maybe we have to say no acquisitions at all in this sector, among the biggest. And also, but we can use this as an opportunity to consider the whole market and consider whether if there are some issue on regulations with respect to entry barriers and whether we can apply or ask for more flexible tools as what you have in the UK. So this is a concern, of course, when we ask for more flexible tools, we may also end up with bigger responsibility and bigger expectations. So that's a concern. But what you are mentioning with respect to market oversight and to consider a whole market, I think that's extremely useful. And as the new head of the Norwegian Competition Authority, this is on my agenda. I want to have a better sense of the whole situation in some markets so that we can consider not only the question of a merger, but whether we should be able to consider it in a bigger context in view of all the sorts of problems in that sector. Yeah. So yes, I'm very positive towards the idea of such.
Thanks.
Such
That's
approaches.
very interesting. Reiko, any thoughts on your side?
There is a lot of attention to the FTC right now. I think it came out yesterday. There was a session where, one of the breakout sessions, I guess, where all the competition authorities seem to be being asked to do something about the inflation, and the FTC is no exception. We have not done a study of changing concentration like as in other countries, other enforcers, but there have been some academic papers that measured increase in concentration in Japan, but there has been no, there seemed to have been no increase in profitability. So the increase in concentration itself has not been a competition issue. I think it's more the price issue. It is known that the wages, however, have not gone up. So but since the profitability hasn't gone up, it's as if the Japanese economy hasn't expanded, which is probably true. But in order to provide stimulation, I think competition is also looked upon as one of the solutions. And as it was debated yesterday, not all problems are competition issues. So we don't want to waste the attention and the hope that FTC is getting, but we also are very careful to do the right things in terms of correcting the problem. And by the way, I wanted to thank CMA and other jurisdictions. I forgot at the end of my last answer, I would like to thank them for making the retrospectives available to everyone to learn from as a public good. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Reiko, much appreciated. Alexandre?
Yeah. In Brazil, I mean, we have a lot of pressure, but it's general pressure in terms of it's a developing country, and the issue right now is gas and oil. It must be in all country, I think. So, and especially the price of the gas in Brazil. Our structure of transportation in Brazil is based on oil, and this like raised the pressure also for the inflation and everything. So when everybody keep asking, where is Cadi? So let's do something. But we know that nobody here want to control price and this kind of stuff. So the idea is bring more competition. And in this, specifically in this sector, like 3 years ago, we have Petrobras. It's a public company. It's half public, half private. So and we got in a process to divestiture many parts of Petrobras in order to bring more competitors and trying to be like rivals and to put the price down. So this is the main idea that CAD should do. And we have been doing this, not just in this sector, but other sectors as well. And also the other role that we can play to help and intervene in some specific market is do the advocacy. So there's some specific regulator that there's a lot of rules with creating barrier of entry, so we can go there and talk to them and say, write a paper, write an opinion and say, hey, let's move this, let's change this, and try to bring more competition to this specific sector. And this is the thing that we can do. And also there is more like a hard intervention that we can do if you find some abuse of dominance, for example. And we can like proactive, keep like researching the market, and trying to get data that we have, public data, and also send letters to the company, bring some information, and we can analyze the market and say, oh, this is getting very concentrated, you're abusing of your dominance, so we open an investigation, and this will be kind of more hard intervention.
Great, thank you. Cani, you have the final word for this session.
If you talk about being in the spotlight now because of the inflation, I mean, I'm not only the competition authority, but I am also the energy regulator in Spain. So you can imagine that it is, well, at this moment we are quite busy. But I would like to say that we shouldn't allow that the urgent things will divide, will deviate us from the important things. And we are there in order to promote competition in the market. So there are situations like this one in which we have to make sure that because of the difficult situations, there are no less competition even because of the potential behaviors of companies or any other agents, but we have also to pay attention to more medium and long-term problems in the markets. And that is why we are, even in these difficult times, we are continuing with our studies, for example, in the distribution of pharmaceutical products, where we have seen for quite some time problems, or in the long-distance bus concessions, where we also, and it was mentioned in one of the sessions yesterday or the day before, Spain has not liberalized yet this area, so we are very active in making a study in order to promote competition. So we have identified sectors in which, from our advocacy department, we are contributing with the studies and recommendations, and we are also doing a very active job in advocacy in the legislation phase, because by law, we have to be consulted in every single piece of legislation that will impact any market. So last year, it was almost 30 reports that we issued in different pieces of legislation, trying to tackle all the problems that we experience. So yeah, I think it is an ongoing job. In urgent cases, we have to be there in order to provide the warranty to the consumers that we are vigilant, but without losing the perspective that we are there in order to promote more competition in the medium and long term.
Yeah, great. Very interesting. So let me thank the panelists. Thank you very much. And I think, Andreas, you will have the final word.